Jacob was not looking for enlightenment when he fell asleep that night. He was exhausted. He had been running. He had fled his home after stealing Esau's blessing and breaking the peace and tradition of his family. He wandered the countryside and found himself in a lonely place under a vast and different sky, not a temple or a sanctuary, just open ground. He took a stone and used it as a pillow because there was nothing else, and he lay down in the dust. And that night he dreamt. Not a dream of comfort or reassurance. He dreamt of a ladder set upon the earth, its top reaching through the clouds and all the way into heaven. And on it he saw angels, living flames, beings of pure movement, ascending and descending upon it. Not ascending and staying, ascending and then descending. When Jacob woke, he said, "Surely the divine is in this place, and I did not know it." He named the place Bethel, or house of God. Jacob's ladder shows us that the sacred is not only above us, but it is also right here in the dust on the road, in the consequences of our actions, and in our bodies. Now notice something carefully, because this is one of the deepest keys to the tree of life. The ladder was not suspended in heaven. It was planted in the earth. It begins in the ground, and then it reaches upward, and the traffic moves both ways. This is why the tree of life is not a ladder to climb that you climb at once and then you abandon it. It is a circulation system between states of consciousness. It is a pattern of movement through which spirit becomes embodied, and embodiment remembers spirit. The mystics later gave a name to this angelic rhythm, Ratzo Vishov, the running and returning. Running toward the infinite is the surge of longing, of awe and expansion and revelation. Returning to embodiment is the anchoring of that revelation into real life, into our ethics and speech and action, and into our relationships. Because if an angel were only to run, it would dissolve into the light and abandon creation. If an angel were only to return without ever lifting its gaze back up to heaven, it would forget why it existed at all. And so the angels live in that rhythm. But the sages say that this is not only how angels move, but also how the human soul moves. Every time you feel inspired, expanded, or filled with sudden understanding, you are running. Every time you bring that understanding into a real conversation, into a boundary, an apology, a creative act, or even just a moment of rest, you are returning. The problem isn't ascent or descent. As I've said before, the problem is living in only one direction. Too much running becomes intensity without any containment, visions without life, insight without grounding, and light without a vessel to contain it. Too much returning without the renewal, it becomes numbness. It becomes heaviness, your routine without meaning, or obligation without any feeling, or life without breath. Welcome to Embodying the Tree of Life, a living approach to Kabbalah. In this episode, we are going to talk about the movement on the tree, the 3 pillars and the 4 worlds of the tree, as well as the secret Sephiroth, Da'at. Now, when we talk about movement, we are not talking about it as any form of achievement or climbing. In the tree, movement is circulation, regulation, and relationship. And before we go further, I want to remind you, as in the previous orientations, that I use the spiral method. So that just means we will approach these truths and concepts from multiple angles that are mythic, psychological, esoteric, and practical. We will repeat them from these different perspectives so that they can land not only in the mind, but in the nervous system. So go slowly. Your spiritual path is your responsibility, not as a burden, but as sovereignty. Nothing here is meant to be rushed or consumed. Let it unfold at the speed of integration. Remember, we're always talking about integration. Pause whenever you need and return whenever the spirit stirs. Now we move into the map. In the previous videos, we spoke about the tree of life as a blueprint of consciousness and about light and shadow as expressions of the same forces held in different ways. Now we turn to movement. The tree is made of two essential elements. The sephiro are stable centers of expression, sort of like the organs in the body. The pathways are the channels of movement between the sephiro, sort of like the nerves, vessels, and communication lines in the body. Without pathways, the organs are isolated and the body cannot function or coordinate. Without those centers or the organs, the pathways have nowhere to land. This is why most important spiritual questions are rarely things like, where am I on the tree? More often, it's like, how am I moving through life right now? How am I moving on the tree? Because much suffering in spiritual work comes from identifying with position rather than movement, thinking there's somewhere to go. Someone can have profound insight and still have poor integration. For example, someone can be heavy on theory, but have no way to apply their knowledge practically to their life to make it better. And if you can't, then what's the point? Someone else can feel grounded and live these principles, be balanced, ethical, and deeply awake, and never use a spiritual word in their life. And that's fine. The tree is not impressed by altitude. It responds to circulation. Most imbalance isn't being too low on the tree. It's usually stagnation, flooding, or splitting. So stagnation is no movement. So you get stuck in one spot. Flooding is too much movement too quickly that you cannot integrate, and that overwhelms you. And splitting is movement that does not connect back to the whole. So that's like hyper-focusing on one spot and being divided. Here's a simple example that almost everyone will probably recognize. Have you ever had a moment of real clarity, like a download, a deep, honest insight, and then like a week later, you found yourself acting as if it had never happened? That's not hypocrisy or failure or anything like that. That is movement outrunning integration. Now, in traditional language, the tree includes two great currents. The descent current is manifestation. One current is the unfolding of creation, energy descending into form. In many traditions, this is shown as the lightning flash, the movement from potential into manifestation. It is not ascent, it is manifestation. It is how intention becomes thought, which then becomes emotion, which then becomes action. And then, of course, action becomes the world you live in and that you create. The return current is integration. It is the current of return, awareness ascending back towards source, sometimes depicted as a winding return up the tree. It is crucial not to moralize these movements. Ascent is not better. Descent is not worse. Ascent refers to insight, expansion, clarity, and meaning. Descent refers to embodiment, application, digestion, repair. Ascent without descent can lead to inflation. Oh, I'm holier than thou art. Descent without ascent leads to being mired down in this world. Inspiration without follow-through will become fantasy. Routine without meaning becomes numbness. Wisdom is not found at the top of the tree. It is found in the rhythm, the Ratzo Vashov, the running and returning. Let me give 3 ordinary examples because the tree lives in ordinary places. A revelation you cannot yet live is when you understand what you need to do, you even believe in it, but your body does not comply yet. Such as realizing you need to set a boundary with a family member and fully agreeing with that truth in your mind. Yet when the moment comes, your throat tightens and you say yes again, even though you meant to say no. That is not contradiction or hypocrisy. That is the gap between knowing and being. Another example is getting a spiritual high that becomes irritability. Sometimes when you touch something beautiful and profound, you can become impatient with everyone and with real life. This could be shown if you went to like a spiritual retreat and when you left, you felt open and expansive, only to find yourself snapping at your partner over something small because ordinary life suddenly feels dense and slow. That doesn't mean love is false. It means that the nervous system has not yet found a way to hold the voltage that has come through. A third example is grounding that becomes resignation. This is when someone becomes very practical and realistic, but then the soul dries out. There's no pizzazz or flair, such as telling yourself you were just being very mature and responsible, while quietly abandoning a creative dream or having fun or playing, things that made you feel alive, convincing yourself it was unrealistic when in truth, something tender in you simply stopped reaching. That is descent without renewal, returning without ever running. The tree is not asking you to choose one current. It is asking you to circulate. This is where we approach the three pillars, which are not just mystical, but psychological as well. The tree is organized around three primary currents called pillars. These are not moral categories and they're not good versus evil. They are forces of regulation. The way that consciousness balances itself within. The right pillar is expansion, also called mercy. This current emphasizes, obviously, mercy, generosity, openness, warmth, meaning, and blessing. In life, it practically looks like trust, forgiveness, enthusiasm, when you have creative flow, the urge to help others and to give. In Jungian language, this expansion current resonates with the archetypal forces like the lover, which is connection and devotion, the magician, which is creative will and meaning making, and the caregiver, which is a nurturing and compassionate person. In balance, the right pillar opens up your life. In distortion, it becomes over rescuing instead of loving, or indulgence instead of joy, bypassing instead of having compassion, and inflating yourself instead of just having pure faith. The left pillar is contraction, also called severity. This current emphasizes structure, discernment, when you have boundaries, clarity, limitation, and consequence. In practical life, it looks like having integrity, having containment, saying no, being precise, and being responsible. Psychologically, it resonates with the ruler, which is order and governance, the warrior, which is discipline and projection, and the inner judge, which is discernment. In balance, the left pillar stabilizes your life. In distortion, it becomes rigid or cruel instead of having clarity. It could be control instead of discipline and cynicism instead of discernment. It also could be something like punishment instead of natural consequences. Now, the middle pillar is integration. It is not compromising between the two, and it's not like halfway. It is the capacity to hold tension consciously between the two sides without collapsing into either extreme. The middle pillar is where opposites become workable together. Love is held by discernment, so you just aren't flailing around. Discernment is softened by love. In Jung's language, This is very close to the movement towards the self, not the ego's identity, but the integrated whole. Individuation, in Jung's view, is not becoming a perfect human, whatever that is. It is becoming whole. It is the psyche learning to belong to itself and not to these things the world creates. And this is what the tree teaches, not purity, but relationship. And now let's go a layer deeper. Jung describes a basic psychic structure of the mind. The ego is your sense of I. Your persona is the social mask you wear, the identity you learn to adopt so that you can belong. Here's a quote attributed to Franz Kafka that says, "I was ashamed when I realized life was a costume party, but I attended with my real face." That's the persona. The shadow is everything that you've disowned, not only what is labeled as bad, but also your unlived vitality and dreams and softness and power and joy. Jung says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will control your life and you will call it fate. This is the shadow unintegrated. The anima or animus is the bridge between ego and the deeper psyche, the inner other. It's like a mediator, a soulful mediator. The self is the organizing center of wholeness, larger than the ego. Okay, so now that we understand the Jungian framework, here is the tree-aligned insight. The persona tends to live strongly in the formed and embodied layers, in the world of roles, language, and behavior. The shadow often hides where relationship within the tree breaks, where a force becomes isolated, denied, or exiled. The anima or animus often appears in the liminal zones of the tree, where meaning tries to cross from idea into feeling and then into our regular lives. The self resonates with the middle pillar's integrative function. This is why spiritual imbalance often looks like a pendulum. Right pillar inflation to left pillar collapse, or left pillar rigidity to right pillar overflow. The middle pillar sanctifies tension rather than eliminating it. It turns tension into music instead of war within you. Jung also describes different complexes as semi-autonomous clusters of emotion and memory that behave like splinter personalities. When archetypal forces are split from consciousness, from conscious relationship, this is what happens. And that parallels the tree's teaching that one-sided movement isolates energy into distortion and makes it act without consent. And this is why the work is not to eradicate one side and live only in another, but to restore circulation so that love is held by discernment and discernment is softened by love. And that both are lived through this center, through presence. You know, in Buddhism, they call it the middle way, through the body, through real life. Now we have one more lens that will make this movement feel concrete. We need the four worlds. In Kabbalistic tradition, reality is not one layer. It is a descent through degrees. It is not four separate places. It is four textures of the same existence through which the same pattern becomes real. Let me tell it to you in three metaphors, because hopefully one of them will land where the others may not. So, metaphor one is the king's garden. A king dreams of a garden. In his heart, it exists a luminous vision. There's no soil or seed yet, only pure pattern. This is absolute. Then the king begins to imagine the atmosphere, the feeling, the meaning of the garden. It becomes a world inside of him. This is Bria. Then plans are drawn up, irrigation is mapped, pathways are designed, structure starts forming. This is Yetzira. Finally, hands enter the soil, seeds are planted, dirt touches the skin. The garden becomes reality. This is Asaya. It is the same garden in four different degrees. Metaphor 2 is a seed becoming a tree. First, there is the seed, the essence of treeness, pure potential. Then the pattern organizes. The seedling pops out of the ground. Then the shaping takes form. The branches open, the leaves grow. Then the tree exists fully in lived reality through the seasons. Metaphor 3 is a song becoming sound. First, it exists as an idea, then as a composition, then as a performance, and then as the actual sound in a room. Now we name the worlds. Absolute is emanation, such as the king's dream, the unplanted seed, and the idea of a song. This is archetypal pattern, pure potential, the fool. Bria is creation, the king's inner planning of the garden, the seedling popping out, and the composition of the music. Here, meaning begins to organize itself. This is the womb of ideas. Yetzira is formation, such as the king's written garden plans, the tree starting to branch out, or the music being performed. So this is where images, emotion, and inner architecture start to form. Asaya is action, the king's garden planted, the tree being grown and moving with the seasons, the sound of the music emanating through a room. This is truly embodied reality, behavior, matter, life as it is lived. In the common Western esoteric mapping we are using, these worlds also align with the 4 elements and the 4 suits of the tarot. Absolute is fire and wands. It is archetypal will, spark, and pure impulse of becoming. Bria is water and cups. So that is soul, emotion, meaning, the imaginal world, and the deep, deep feeling world. Yetzira is air and swords. It is the mind, perception, structure, and patterning. Asaya is earth and pentacles. It is body, going to work, dealing with time and material life. And here's why this matters practically. Sometimes people try to solve an Asaya or real world problem, something embodied and behavioral. Sometimes they try to solve that using only absolute or spiritual language or theoretical language. They try to understand their way out of grief, or they try to affirm their way out of trauma. They try to conceptualize their way into a regulated nervous system. But the tree teaches different correspondences. Each world requires its own medicine. Absolute asks, which archetype are you embodying, and what the deep pattern is in your subconscious mind. Bria asks, what meaning is being born, and what story are you living? What story are you repeating to yourself over and over again? Yetzira asks, what feelings, images, and inner formations are shaping this? What conscious patterns are shaping you and your life? And then Asaya asks, what must be done, repaired, embodied, and chosen in order to heal and integrate, therefore making your life better? A spiritual life is not choosing one world and rejecting the others. It is learning to move between them without getting lost. And here is the humility of the tree. Asaya is not the lowest as an insult. Asaya is where the sparks are gathered. Asaya is where the Shekinah, the sacred spirit of creation, is found. Asaya is where the tree becomes honest. So if you want to feel the 4 worlds in your daily life, an impulse of pure inspiration appears in absolute, fire, wands. It forms into intention and meaning in Bria, water, cups. It then shapes your thought, your image, your plans, and your inner structures in Yetzira, air, which is swords. And then it becomes a real choice, an action, a boundary, a repair, or even rest here in Asaya, earth, and pentacles. That is the tree moving through the worlds. The health of your path depends on whether you can complete the descent and ascent again and again without losing the thread. And now we're going to spiral into the myth of descent itself, because descent is where many people get afraid. To understand descent, we will start with Innana. Innana is the queen of heaven, radiant, powerful, and crowned. She decides, for reasons that vary across tellings, to descend into the underworld, the realm of her sister, the place of death, of shadow, and truth without ornament. In some tellings, she descends as a quest to expand her own sovereignty even over death, and to claim her authority in her sister's realm. In other tellings, she descends as a confrontation born of grief and rivalry after the death of her sister's consort. In each version, she approaches the first gate, and the gatekeeper says, "This is the law of the underworld," and he removes her crown. At the second gate, he removes her necklace. At the third, her breastplate. At the fourth, the ornaments at her waist. Gate by gate, symbol by symbol, she is stripped. Not because she's being punished, but because the underworld does not accept inflation of any kind. By the time she reaches the throne room, she stands naked. She is judged. In some tellings, she is killed or hung and left there. She is powerless and exposed. She has no persona left, no jewelry, no story to protect her. This is the psychological truth of descent. You cannot carry the crown into the depths unless you are willing to be stripped of what you used to be. This is not failure. It is initiation. In Jungian language, this is the confrontation with the shadow, your disowned psychic material. It's not just darkness. It is the unlived life force, the parts of you that were unwelcome. It is the truth that you were not allowed to hold even when you wanted to, the emotions you learned to exile within yourself. Jung also taught that individuation requires meeting the anima or animus, the inner other that mediates between the ego and the unconscious mind. This messenger leads you deeper and also back out again. Innana eventually returns, but she does not return as the same queen. She returns as someone who has been through the underworld and can no longer pretend that she has not. That is the tree's teaching. Ascent without descent becomes delusion. Without descent, the crown sits on an unstable head. Now let's spiral back to tarot, because tarot is one of the most precise image languages for all of this information. In the Western esoteric tradition, the 22 major arcana cards are mapped onto the 22 pathways of the tree. The majors are not events, they are archetypal reorganizations of identity. For example, the Fool is unconditioned potential. The Magician is directed will and agency. And the High Priestess is inner knowing and the gate of the unconscious mind. The Empress is generative abundance. And the Emperor is structure and order. Death is transformation. And the Tower is destabilization. And of course, the World is integration in form. Every one of these archetypes has a light and a shadow. Archetypes are not moral, they are voltage. A force held in relationship becomes medicine. A force isolated becomes distortion. The tree is not only made of initiations, it is made of Tuesday afternoons, of getting stuck in traffic, of doing the dishes. This is where the minor arcana, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those become essential. The minors show how archetypal forces land in your daily life, including the way you think, the way you feel, different conflicts, going to work, spending money, trying to find time, how your body's working, how your relationships are doing. The suits mirror the four worlds and the elements. Wands and fire express drive, spark, will, and creative eruption. Cups and water express your feelings, your longing, your devotion, and relational flow. Swords and air are all about your mind, your perception, how you handle conflict, how you cut through to clarity. And pentacles and earth express body, work, resources, time, and obviously physical manifestation. So you can diagnose an imbalance by this suit language. A surge of wand energy that never becomes grounded by pentacles is inspiration that never becomes embodied and stays in the idea realm. Too many swords without cups is mind without emotion or clarity without compassion. But cups without swords can become feeling everything but having no discernment. Pentacles without wands can become being super stable but not having any vitality. And now let's talk about the court cards. These are the people cards. Pages are princesses, knights, sometimes called princes, and then kings and queens. The court cards are often misunderstood as literal people, but the courts are modes of embodiment. So modes of embodiment, how an element lives through the psyche across time. A queen is not a woman, nor is a king a man. There's no gender here. They are different ways the psyche holds and expresses a specific force, including things like receptivity, initiation, maturity, self-governance, and development. So in this way, tarot becomes a language of that movement. The majors are the big threshold transitions between worlds and identities, those archetypes. The minors are the daily textures of these transitions. And the court cards are the psyche learning to inhabit the energy fully. Remember, these will all be discussed in greater detail as we walk the pathways of the tree. Now, the Hebrew letters, as I've said in a previous video, they function like verbs. They describe how transitions happen. You do not need to memorize them all at once. Learning too quickly, as I said before, often disconnects from lived experience. But it is useful to feel the principle that letters are movement. Think about how we are. We are symbolic creatures. Now, to tie tarot and Jung together, let's talk about the myth of the Holy Grail. We will return to the idea of vessels that we talked about in the first episode. In Grail legend, told almost fully in the medieval romances of de Troyes and von Eschenbach, a young and untested knight named Percival. Percival leaves his mother's forest home after mistaking armored knights for angels, and driven by a longing for greatness, he enters the world without guidance or without any maturity. After many wanderings, he arrives at a mysterious castle where he is welcomed into a great hall and he witnesses a solemn procession. A bleeding lance is carried before him, then a radiant grail borne by a maiden whose light fills the entire chamber. And presiding over this strange court is the Fisher King, a once mighty ruler who has been grievously wounded in, some say, the thigh or the groin area. And he can no longer stand. His injury has rendered him, not only himself, but his entire kingdom barren and desolate. Percival notices the king's suffering and the uncanny symbols passing before his eyes. Yet he remembers earlier advice he had been given, that a knight should not ask too many questions. A little bit of shadow there, right? And so he remains silent when he should have asked, who does the Grail serve? And he should have asked, why is the king wounded? His silence is not neutral. It is a failure of compassion and courage. And because he does not ask these questions, these healing questions, the king remains wounded and the land remains a wasteland. Percival awakens the next morning only to find that the enchanted mystical castle is now empty. Only years later, after more wandering, suffering, confronting his pride, and recognizing that his earlier silence came from immaturity rather than wisdom, only then does Percival return. And now he's prepared and humbled enough to ask the right question. And in doing so, he restores the king and the kingdom itself, revealing that the Grail was never a prize to seize, but rather a sacred vessel that could only be approached by one whose inner life and perception had been purified of vanity and impulsive ambition. This mirrors the myth of the shattering of the vessels told in the first episode. In this, the primordial containers formed to hold the divine light cracked because they were not capable of sustaining such intensity. And so they scattered sparks throughout creation and taught us that power without preparation fragments the structure meant to hold it. Likewise, the myth of Innana is told in many ways, but in each one she passes through the 7 gates and is stripped of crown, jewels, and garments until she stands exposed before the throne of the underworld and is judged, demonstrating that descent, well, it becomes necessary when identity has grown inflated or when power has not yet been integrated. Psychologically, this reflects Jung's insight that the persona, the social mask formed in the structured layers of our lives, must eventually be relinquished. This is so that the shadow, composed of the rejected qualities and unlived potentials, can be encountered directly rather than just projected outwardly, and that the anima or animus serves as a mediating figure who guides the ego into deeper layers of psyche and back again. And as we remember, the self stands as the integrative center aligned with the middle pillar, capable of holding the tension between opposites without fragmentation. Jung described different complexes that people get as semi-autonomous clusters of emotion and memory that behave like splinter personalities when archetypal forces are split from conscious relationship. For example, a mother complex can lead someone to unconsciously seek approval, over-nurture others, or react with disproportionate anger or dependency when situations echo early maternal dynamics. Another example is a father complex, which may show up as compulsive rebellion against authority or chronic self-doubt when you are around strong leadership figures. This is because unresolved material tied to the parental image, well, it continues to operate beneath the surface of your awareness. Jung also identified the power complex. This is where a person feels driven to dominate or control in order to compensate for inner insecurity. We've all met those, huh? Similarly, an inferiority complex can cause someone to consistently underestimate themselves and withdraw from opportunity. This is because a deeply charged narrative of inadequacy has taken on a life of its own inside. These examples illustrate that archetypal energies, when not consciously integrated, do not disappear. They organize into patterns. These patterns think, feel, and react within us as if they were independent personalities. Have you ever felt like that before? Like someone else was taking the wheel? This parallels the tree's teaching that one-sided movement isolates energy into distortion. And finally, Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold tension between opposites long enough for a third reconciling attitude to emerge. This reflects the middle pillar's work and the careful crossing of Da'at, the hidden Sephira, which we will dive into in just a moment. This is where knowledge must ripen into embodied wisdom rather than inflate the ego. Together, these myths and psychological layers and frameworks remind us that the Grail cannot be seized, the vessels cannot be rushed, and the descent is not failure, but the necessary preparation that allows light to be held without shattering. And now we come to the threshold where this all becomes the most intense. We come to Da'at. There is one place on the tree that requires special care, not because it is evil or anything like that, but because it is powerful. It is a threshold rather than a center, and it is called Da'at, often translated as knowledge. But Da'at is not information. It is the pressure of transition. It appears when understanding is present, but embodiment is not yet complete. We all know this experience and feeling. You understand something intellectually, but you cannot live it yet. You cannot embody it yet. Your nervous system has not reorganized itself around it yet. That tension between who you were and who you're becoming, of what you knew and what you're knowing, that's Da'at. Let's talk about 3 metaphors because Da'at is better felt than defined. Number 1, imagine climbing a mountain. Below you is a valley, and that's where you started. That's familiar identity, familiar reality. And above you is a new landscape you've never experienced before, new awareness. And between them is a narrow pass. From that pass, you can see both worlds at once. It's breathtaking but destabilizing. That pass is Da'at. You're neither there nor there. You can't rush across it because if you lose your footing, you'll fall. And if you refuse to cross, you remain divided. Da'at is not a sephira to achieve. It is the pressure of being between identities. Ooh, it's a painful place too. Da'at is like an airlock between 2 environments. If you open both doors at once, pressure equalization becomes violent. You have to open one door, go inside, close it, and open the other one. But when done properly, the nervous system can adapt. This is why Da'at is destabilizing when rushed, not because it is dark, but because it removes illusions faster than the psyche can reorganize. Da'at is what it feels like when the psyche is running a system update. Example 3. The old operating system no longer works. The new one has not been installed yet. So everything feels glitchy for a while. And you feel kind of in between. Now here's the core law repeated because it is the safeguard of the whole tree. Movement must always be matched by integration. Most imbalance on the tree does not come from what is encountered on the tree, even on the cliff off the dark side, the distortions. It is from being encountered too quickly. Da'at, approached naturally, facilitates integration. Da'at, fixated on or pursued, can destabilize your identity. It can inflate your ego or dissolve your grounding. This is not because it is bad. It is just very powerful. This is why Da'at is not a destination. As I said earlier, it is a threshold. Jacob's ladder rests upon it. Movement both ways. Innana passes through it, stripped of inflation, and the Grail must withstand it, vessel before power. Now later in the series, Da'at will be explored in its own dedicated video. But for now, it is enough to know this. If something feels disorienting, overwhelming, or ungrounding, that is not a sign to push forward. It is a sign to descend, to integrate, to slow down, and to return to the body, to the grounding of Malkut, where all wisdom becomes reality. The tree of life is not a hierarchy. It is a circulatory system. It is Jacob's ladder, planted in the earth with angels moving both ways. It is the lightning flash and the winding light. It is Ratzo Vashov, the running and returning, and Innana's descent, stripping illusion so the crown can be real. It is the Grail, vessel before power. It is the king's garden, dream to design to structure to soil. It is the song, idea to composition to performance to sound in the room. It is fire becoming earth. It is earth remembering that it is fire. It is the archetype becoming your character, and insight becoming the actions of your life. It is meaning becoming your lived ethics. Now take a moment. Feel your feet, feel your breath, and notice how your body responds to the idea of movement, not upward, but through. And just as a note, just by hearing this, some strange things may happen to you. You don't even have to actively study. A lot of times just hearing this or reading about shadow work will start triggering strange dreams or interesting feelings in your body. And that is why pace and integration is so important. So remember, you've listened. That's enough. Nothing needs to be achieved right now. Movement is already happening. Go in peace, beloveds. Return when the rhythm calls.